We know that trauma does not happen in a vacuum. And so our third objective is to look at how individual traumas relate to systems of oppression. We know that our cultural and social contexts affect what kinds of trauma we might be exposed to, how we name it, how we react, whether or not we seek help. Practicing in a culturally responsive and humble way is definitely not unique to trauma work. But it is also absolutely fundamental to trauma work. And as we'll talk about, it's one of the tenets of trauma informed care. In general, we know that people of color are 20 to 50% less likely to initiate mental health care services and 40 to 80% more likely to end treatment prematurely. And we know that clients of color who perceive that mental health professionals don't understand their cultural views are 7 times more likely to end treatment. So, again, this just underscores how fundamental it is to our work that we practice in a culturally humble and responsive way. We know that members of marginalized groups, for example, racial and ethnic minorities, LGBTQ individuals, are at greater risk for experiencing traumatic events, and that they may also have greater difficulty recovering due to difficulty accessing resources and also ineffective services that don't meet their unique needs. This graph here reflects the percentage of children nationally who've experienced at least one adverse childhood event, like child abuse or domestic violence. And as you can see, there are significant racial ethnic disparities, with Black and Latinx children being at greater risk. I really want to underscore that these racial and ethnic disparities in exposure to traumatic experiences don't reflect individuals' deficits or pathologies, but rather they reflect how oppressive systems like racism or heterosexism disproportionately hurt the lives of individuals and marginalized groups. So, for example, African American children are more likely to be exposed to police violence or racial profiling. Their caregivers are more likely to be targets of unwarranted police attention. Also, for the African American community, residential racial segregation, which results from decades of deliberately discriminatory federal, state, and local policies, has led to a concentration of risk factors in those communities, which increase the likelihood of trauma. So, that includes things like poverty or higher parental incarceration rates. So these systemic injustices and oppression increase the likelihood that marginalized individuals will be exposed to trauma. We might consider some of the ways in which individual level traumas occur within the context of oppressive systems like racism and sexism. So, for example, one individual level sexual assault of a woman by a man occurs within a context in which masculinity is associated with domination, with power, with hypersexuality, with violence, and femininity is associated with submission. Or one individual level encounter between a white police officer and a young man of color, in which the man is treated as though he were a violent criminal when he's not, is also rooted in historic and ongoing racism, as well as deep seated stereotypes of Black men as violent or dangerous or needing to be controlled. One individual level incident of a bullying of a gay or trans youth occurs within the context of ongoing norms of heterosexism and homophobic attitudes. So, some examples of cultural and social context specific sources of trauma might include things like racism, discrimination, police brutality, gender based violence like domestic violence or sexual assault, bullying or persecution of LGBTQ youth on the basis of their gender and sexual identities, migration specific traumas among immigrants like family separation or loved ones deportation, political oppression experienced by refugees who have been persecuted on the basis of several factors, including things like political affiliation or religion, and also historical and intergenerational trauma. Historical trauma is trauma that's inflicted. inflicted on an entire group, so say slavery or genocide, that result in mass trauma. Historical trauma works by destroying local traditions and social bonds, by destroying social systems and collective self esteem. So, an example might be when American Indian children were taken away from their parents and put into boarding schools where they were banned from using their language or practicing their culture. And this is referred to as a soul wound within the community because the impacts have really been felt for generations. Intergenerational trauma refers to the impact of traumatic events that are transmitted from one generation to the next. And historical and intergenerational trauma can be passed on through exposure to parental trauma, as well as the associated experience of downward economic and social mobility. We can also see an intersection between systemic oppression and intergenerational trauma. So consider, for example, how intergenerational impact of slavery on the African American community intersects with present day racism or police brutality. So you can watch this clip here of a trauma therapist and scholar named Resmaa Menakem, who wrote a great book called My Grandmother's Hands. Here he discusses how a previous generation's trauma might impact an individual, in part through increasing risk for substance use. And next, and after you watch that, in the following slide, you're also going to hear a clip from an NPR story about what scientists are learning about the effects of racism on our bodies.
If something is happening to you and it doesn't make logical sense, right? If something is happening to me and it's coming to me in images, or it's coming to me in a sensation, or it's coming to me as a vibe, right? If that doesn't make sense, there's nothing to do but to internalize it or dissociate from it, right? And if I don't have the ability to either fight or flee from this thing, I will freeze and dissociate from it. That makes sense as the trauma is happening to me, right? But what happens if that trauma happened to me when I'm 5, or the trauma happened to me before I'm in gestation, right? The trauma happened to my mama's nervous system or my mother's nervous system. And so I'm floating around in that hyper levels of cortisol, the hyper levels of norepinephrine, like all of those things are floating around. So by the time I become a baby, or by the time I get born, I've had all of these kind of chemicals and sensations that my nervous system can't process. So then when I'm born and I'm trying to operate in the world and I'm starting to begin to get these notions and experience these things, and there's nobody telling me, no, this is what it is and this is how it is, because the people before me don't know what it was.
Right.
Right? Mm-hmm. So now my little nervous system is trying to manage that. And that is not even to account for if other traumas are currently happening to me personally.
Right.
Right? It's like the soup. I'm born into this soup, and then I come out, and then something happens to me to add to the soup, right? And so now I'm sitting here, and the weight of it is unexplainable. Nobody's explained it to me. I don't even know who I go to. I go to my minister. My minister doesn't know how to talk to me about it. Mm-hmm. I go to my wife doesn't know how to talk to me about it. I go to a therapist, they don't know how to talk to me about it, right? Mm-hmm. But it's ravaging my body.
Yeah.
Right? It's ravaging my body. And so one of the things that happens is to get from underneath that energy and that pressure, I better smoke some weed. Mm-hmm. I better drink some alcohol. I better shoot something up, right? Because otherwise I can't make it, right? Mm-hmm. And so part of what I talk about is what's fueling the addiction, right? And if we can't get and help people explain not just the personal pieces, but also the historical pieces and what might have gotten passed down, not because my parents weren't smart, but because they didn't know what this was, because it's been decontextualized for such a long time. And so part of what I really try and do especially with regard to addiction, is to help people understand you're not defective.
Right.
You're not defective. Something happened to you. Something has happened to your people. And there has to be something to confront that. And you've been trying to carry it all by yourself. And what I want to say to you is this: you're not defective. You don't have to carry it all by yourself. And some of what you're trying to carry by yourself is not supposed to be carried by you, because it just didn't happen to you. It happened to your people.
Mm-hmm.
So you trying to carry the load of some personally to something that happened to your people.
Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So
go to KillabCenter.com, Radical Recovery Summit, for access to the interviews. You can watch them free online, or you could purchase an all-access pass. KillabCenter.com.
Roughly a third of Latinos in America report they've experienced discrimination in their daily lives. According to a poll recently released by NPR, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. That number is important as scientists begin to learn more about how racism affects people's health and their longevity. Reporter Ray Ellen Bichelle has this next story in our series, You, Me, and Them.
The day Dr. Roberto Montenegro finished his PhD was memorable, but not for the right reasons.
I still cringe when I think about it.
His colleagues at UCLA had taken him and his wife out to a fancy restaurant. They were celebrating his new PhD in sociology, and he was about to head to medical school. He was legit.
We laughed and we ate and we were excited we didn't have to pay for this.
But when they got in line for the valet, a really nice car pulled up to the curb. A woman got out and walked past the other couples in line, Montenegro says, and
She gets to me and she hands me her keys.
she assumed he was a valet.
I vividly remember turning red, and I don't often turn red, and I remember my heart pounding. I remember feeling really confused and hurt and angry.
5 minutes later, still waiting for his car, it happened again.
And even now, reliving that story, it's uncomfortable.
This was not the first or the last time he'd encounter racism. At conferences, colleagues would accidentally try to order drinks from him. As a medical student, people at the hospital would sometimes mistake him for a technician or a janitor, even when he was wearing his white doctor's coat.
That happens to me so much.
Montenegro's experiences might not sound like a big deal, but a group of researchers thinks that being discriminated against over and over again could actually hurt a person's health.
When you start to worry about something, whether that's race or something else, then that initiates a biological stress response.
That's Amani Nuru-Jeter, a social epidemiologist at the University of California, Berkeley. She and Dr. Montenegro, who's now a fellow in child psychiatry at Seattle Children's Hospital, are trying to understand what discrimination can actually do to your body. That night people assume Montenegro was a valet,
Turning red and my heart pounding.
those are signs his body was stressed, cranking up the levels of hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. Those hormones can be really helpful for gearing up to fight or to flee, but it's not good if they linger.
For example, one of the things we're finding in my research is that this process of racism stress is associated with kind of chronic low-grade inflammation.
And that, says Nuru-Jeter, could put someone at a higher risk for something like heart disease. Other studies have found associations between racist experiences and things like sleep problems or even asthma. Researchers like Nuru-Jeter hypothesize that the stress of repeatedly being singled out as the other can be biologically damaging and might be responsible, in part, for health disparities in America, like the gap in life expectancy between Black and white Americans.
Prolonged elevation, circulation of these stress hormones in our bodies can be very toxic and compromise our body's ability to regulate key biological systems. So it just gets us really out of whack and leaves us susceptible to a bunch of poor health outcomes.
Now, this kind of research is really complicated. There's no thermometer for racism, and it's not like scientists can take a group of people, expose them to discrimination, and then see how they do compared to everyone else. So researchers find associations, not causations. But sometimes they get a slightly sharper glimpse of how discrimination and poor health might be related. Like on May 12th, 2008, when, as the AP reported, a small army descended onto a town in Iowa.
Federal agents raided this meatpacking plant in Iowa on Monday after
900 agents with Immigrations and Customs Enforcement raided a meat processing plant. They were looking for people who were working illegally in the U.S. They reportedly handcuffed almost everyone who looked Latino and ended up arresting more than a tenth of the town's population, charging many of them with felonies for knowingly working under false Social Security numbers, even though few were reportedly guilty of that crime.
In all, more than 300 people were loaded onto buses and taken away.
Arlene T. Geronimus, a behavioral scientist at the University of Michigan, has studied the episode.
The news of this raid and pictures were pretty frightening because there were these helicopters and it was such a military zone. And then they had, handcuffing all the employees who were assumed to be Latino.
It was an extremely stressful event for the people who got arrested and their families. But the event appears to have had a ripple effect throughout the state. As Geronimus and her colleagues wrote this year in the International Journal of Epidemiology, after the raid, Latino women living in Iowa started giving birth to smaller babies.
Pregnant women of Latino descent throughout the state of Iowa experienced, on average, about a 24% greater risk of their babies being born low birth weight than they had in that very same period of time the previous year.
Babies born small are at higher risk of dying in infancy and of having health problems later on. Before the raid, Latino women in Iowa didn't have a higher risk of low birth weight than white women did.
But there is a spike that happens to be exactly when the raid was.
A spike in that rate that even affected babies born to Latina moms who were U.S. citizens, people who shouldn't have been worried about being arrested or deported.
The trends are so stark.
Other researchers have noticed a connection between experiencing stressful events like natural disasters and babies being born preterm or low birth weight. Geronimus thinks in this case it has something to do with the stress of racism. And if that's true, it means the stress of discrimination can set the stage for health problems before a person has even entered the world. For NPR News, I'm Raellen Bichelle.
And then finally, you can follow this clip to hear from a survivor about why it is so important to address race, gender, culture, and history in our work with survivors.
I believe that it's important to focus on cultural, historical, and gender issues so that the system as a whole, avoids the re-traumatization of its patients, of its clients, of the peers, and that is something that is important to me because I entered the system as a traumatized child, and those were some of the issues that were impacting me at home, in my community. I grew up in a low-income family household or in a community. My mom was on public assistance. She was on welfare. We lived in Washington, D.C., and also on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., where there was rampant poverty. There was racism. There were so many elements to living in what many would call the hood or the ghetto or an area like that, and often you saw individuals being pulled over, what seemed to be for sometimes no reason at all, but we know there were reasons. But today, how that's played out with me is, I've been pulled over many times by police officers, and in one particular time I was pulled over and I completely felt humiliated because I felt isolated on that road. I was by myself, and they pulled me over. When I asked the officer, "Why are you pulling me over?" He said to me, "Well, you were following the car in front of you too closely." And I thought, well, you pushed me into that car. You came behind me and pulled up on me, so you don't have a valid reason for pulling me over. And so I felt like, what I looked like, who I was the reason that he pulled me over. It was a very difficult situation, and it happens. Unfortunately, it happens on a regular basis. But not only in the community that it happens, but when I was in residential treatment, oftentimes I felt like the people who were serving me, or the individuals or the system who cared for me, didn't understand some of the cultural or some of the historical issues or challenges that resided in my life, that I'd come from this background. And so there was a missing link to the kind of treatment, whether it was culturally specific, that it should have been culturally specific, but there were many times that there was a gap in that. And that really left me feeling a bit, isolated, humiliated, and really embarrassed about being there. Not many people looked like me in the residential treatment setting, and the individuals or the staff who were responsible for our treatment didn't necessarily look like me, and so they didn't know what was my background or probably what was happening in my life, but they didn't know that I sang, which is one of my most common coping strategies. It's the one that I use the most in order to help me soothe or calm down when things are challenging for me, especially emotionally. And that comes from my mom. She used to get up on Saturday mornings, every Saturday morning basically, and she used to wake up the entire house, and we would clean the entire house, and she would play albums like Boy George. And so we're going around the house with a vacuum cleaner and moving about, having a good time. And I valued those moments with her. Those were very special moments, and it was responsible moments. It was also connecting with my mom and my brothers and sister on a very intimate level. And when she was murdered, we lost everything. Our home, all my toys. And today I don't have a photo of her. I don't own a photo of my mom. I don't own a photo of my brother who was murdered, my 12-year-old brother. And I don't own any clothes, nothing that tangibly connected us. But there was a particular time here in residential treatment that I started going to the music class. And there was a music teacher there who found out that I knew how to sing operatically. I knew how to sing classical music. And he was so shocked. And he actually made me the lead singer. So instead of doing Les Mis and Les Miserables and the Phantom of the Opera in the group, I would sing with the group, but he also gave me an opportunity to sing 2 Italian arias. And I have a photo from back then looking at myself in residential treatment singing an Italian aria. And I think it was like a Caro mio ben, credimi almen. And it was a way to connect with my mom and to keep that spirit alive. And that happened in treatment where I didn't think that it could happen. And so that music for me was really, in those dark days and dark nights, music was the great equalizer. It was the comforter. It was the healer. And when staff got that and let me sing the national anthem before we played a baseball game or a football game or a basketball game, it was in those times that I shined, that what was perceived as my weaknesses really were my strengths. My ability to get up and do something that made me feel good about me.
Next, I want to talk about a groundbreaking research study that was conducted by Dr. Vincent Felitti and colleagues, and that showed a high prevalence of adversity in childhood, adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and a relationship between these ACEs and negative health and mental health outcomes throughout the lifespan. Just to give a little historical context, in 1985, Vincent Felitti was the chief of Kaiser Permanente's Department of Preventative Medicine. And they were running an obesity clinic, and they sort of happened upon the finding that there were a number of patients within the obesity clinic who had childhood experiences of sexual abuse. They presented those findings at a conference, and the Center for Disease Control, or CDC, approached them and said, "That's interesting. Why don't we do a larger study drawing on the general population and try to understand if there's some kind of connection between these childhood adverse experiences and chronic health conditions like obesity in adulthood?" And thus was born the Kaiser Permanente CDC ACEs study. So the ACEs original questionnaire looked at 10 different types of adverse experiences. These included experiences related to abuse, so physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, related to neglect, physical and emotional neglect, and related to household dysfunction. So this was having a family member who had a mental illness or a substance use disorder, having a family member who was incarcerated, experiencing domestic violence, and experiencing parents' divorce. And what they found in very quickly was that people who have higher ACEs scores, and if you endorse any one of these experiences, that gives you an ACEs score of 1. If you endorse 2, then that gives you an ACEs score of 2. They found that people who had higher ACEs scores also had a range of negative outcomes, like higher workplace absenteeism, more financial problems, lower lifetime income, also higher levels of depression, suicidality, health problems like heart issues, diabetes, obesity, substance use, and also re-victimization as adults. They also found that adverse experiences are pretty widespread, and that most people in the United States have at least one ACE. This slide just gives you a sense of what the questionnaire looks like. So this is just a sample item. And again, if you answer yes to this, then you get a score of 1. ACEs questionnaire looked at the 10 childhood traumas that were most commonly mentioned by the initial group of 300 individuals participating in this study. But there are a number of other adverse experiences that, might be indicative also of long-term health problems. Things like childhood exposure to racism or bullying, or homelessness, or involvement with the foster care or juvenile justice system, or immigration-related traumas like losing a parent through deportation. This slide here essentially kind of sums up what we said, which is that we have a growing recognition that more adverse childhood experiences accumulated earlier in life are predictive of long-term health and mental health problems, and this is a list of some of them. So there's a growing recognition that long-term health risks like smoking or substance use or obesity may initially have been developed as short-term solutions that were beneficial to an individual as they were trying to cope with the overwhelming distress of early adversity. Next, we're going to review some data on the prevalence of trauma. In this nationally representative study, nearly 9 out of 10 people who were surveyed were exposed to at least one DSM-5 defined traumatic event. And here you can see the breakdown of which were the most prevalent types. With regards to sexual assault, approximately 1 in 6 women experience attempted or completed rape in her lifetime, and that's 1 in 33 for men. The vast majority, over 2/3 of sexual assaults, go unreported, and individuals who are transgender or gender nonconforming are at increased risk, as many as 1 in 5 at risk for sexual violence. And from that visual there, you can see that the majority of sexual assault victims are about 54%, are between the ages of 18 and 34, and the majority of victims overall are under the age of 30. We have similarly staggering statistics when it comes to domestic violence. We know that every minute, 20 people in the United States are physically abused by their partners. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced some form of physical violence by an intimate partner. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men have been victims of severe violence by an intimate partner. 1 in 7 women, 1 in 18 men have been stalked. And again, younger women are more commonly the victims of domestic violence. In Rhode Island, nearly 1 in 3, so 30% of Rhode Island women, and nearly 1 in 5, 19% of Rhode Island men experience intimate partner physical violence, partner rape, or stalking in their lifetimes. So it's prevalent nationally, it's also prevalent, unfortunately, here in Rhode Island. And here we can see rates of exposure among children and teenagers. So, for example, 3/4 of children exposed to violence each year, 3 million children the victims of maltreatment or neglect. Depending on the study, between 3.5 and 10 million children who witnessed domestic violence against their mothers. 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys were physically abused before adulthood, and 94% of children in a study of juvenile justice settings who had been exposed to trauma. So almost every kid who ends up in the juvenile justice system has been a victim and survivor of trauma. Finally, we're going to look at the tenets of trauma-informed care and look at how systems are beginning to revisit how they conduct their business in order to enhance people's outcomes and empower them and resist re-traumatizing them. As SAMHSA and others have pointed out, many public institutions and service systems that are intended to provide services and supports to individuals can, without awareness themselves, be trauma-inducing. When, for example, we use coercive practices like seclusion or restraints in the behavioral health system. When, for example, we abruptly remove a child from a family in the child welfare system. When, for example, we use invasive procedures without any kind of explanation or preparation within the medical system. When, for example, we use harsh disciplinary practices in educational or school systems. When, for example, we use intimidating practices in the criminal justice system. All of these can be re-traumatizing for individuals who enter these systems with significant histories of trauma. According to SAMHSA, there are 4 R's of a trauma-informed program, organization, or system. First of all, people at all levels of the organization or system have a basic realization about trauma and understand how trauma can affect families, groups, organizations, and communities, as well as individuals. Secondly, people within the organization are able to recognize signs of trauma. Thirdly, the program, the organization or system can respond by applying principles of trauma-informed approaches to all areas of functioning. And that includes every staff member, whether it be the person greeting the client at the door, or whether that be an executive or governance board. They use language, behaviors, and policies that take into consideration the experiences of trauma among the children and adult users of the services, as well as among the staff providers providing the services. And then lastly, the fourth R is that across the organization, we seek to resist re-traumatizing individuals. According to SAMHSA, this visual here outlines the 6 core concepts or principles of a trauma-informed approach. So first, safety. And I would encourage you to follow this hyperlink to hear a survivor talking about the importance of safety and what safety looks like and does not look like within organizations. With regards to safety, this has to do with the safety of both the people served and the staff, and prioritizing that they are physically and psychologically safe, and that the physical setting and interpersonal interactions promote a sense of safety. With regards to trustworthiness and transparency, this is the idea that decisions and operations are conducted with transparency and with the goal of building and maintaining trust with clients and families and staff. Peer support has to do with the importance of peers or those who may have similar histories, as well as mutual self-help, that these are key vehicles for establishing safety and hope and building trust and enhancing collaboration. The idea that lived experience can be used to promote recovery. Fourth, collaboration and mutuality. This is about leveling power differences between staff and clients, and also among organizational staff, from people who have clerical or housekeeping positions to professional staff to administrative staff. The idea that everyone has a role within the organization to play in a trauma-informed approach. Fifth, empowerment, voice, and choice is the idea that we emphasize individual strengths and experiences and we build on those. Clients are supported in shared decision-making, in choice, in goal setting, and supported in self-advocacy skills. And lastly, cultural humility has to do with paying attention to culture, to history, to gender, to actively move past stereotypes like racial stereotypes and biases, to offer gender responsive services, as well as to leverage the healing value of traditional cultural connections, and to use policies and protocols that are responsive to diverse racial, ethnic, and cultural identities and needs, and that we recognize and address historical trauma.
Safety is a fundamental principle of trauma-informed care. A holistic concept of safety means that throughout the organization, staff and the people they serve feel physically and psychologically safe. The physical setting is safe, and interpersonal interactions promote a sense of safety. Safety is one of our deepest human needs and is an essential precondition for healing from trauma. As a young person experiencing troubling psychiatric symptoms related to my childhood trauma, including suicidality, I experienced many unwanted, traumatic, and humiliating interventions, all in the name of safety. Despite a lot of talk about the need to keep me safe, no one ever asked me if I felt safe or what I would need in order to feel safe. we need to understand that all too often safety is a euphemism for control. A safety as control approach is traumatizing for all, including the staff who are put in the position all too often of enforcing control. A trauma-informed approach to safety is by definition collaborative and person-centered. A specific example is in the area of suicide prevention, where safety is often a very real concern. A non-trauma-informed approach to safety would coerce a suicidal person into signing a no-suicide contract. This is a request that is often made for the safety and comfort of the treating professional, rather than for the person who is suicidal. Conversely, a trauma-informed approach would involve a mutual discussion about what safety is, what help looks like, and what next steps and supports might be useful for the person who is feeling suicidal. I didn't discover a sense of safety until much later in life, when I connected with other trauma survivors and people who had been suicidal like me and had found recovery and hope. When I finally felt emotionally and psychologically safe, I could begin to examine the roots of my traumatic experiences through peer support and through trauma-specific services such as cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, and mind-body approaches such as mindfulness. Agencies looking to create a trauma-informed culture would be good to make the safety of all a top priority. One concrete way to address this is to evaluate the physical environment and whether or not it promotes a sense of safety. Is it noisy and chaotic, or does it feel soothing and peaceful? Does it feel cold and institutional, or is it colorful and enlivened by natural light, comfortable seating, etc.? To create a sense of emotional safety, agencies can evaluate how people are interacting with and relating to one another. Are seclusion and physical or chemical restraint being used? And what are some ways to reduce and eliminate these practices? Are people accessible, or is everyone too busy to spend time engaging in authentic human interactions with one another? Are people trained to use trauma-sensitive language that is person-first and does not identify others only by their symptoms or perceived deficits? Is there a continual effort to seek feedback, both from staff and people being served, about how to foster a total environment of safety? Are there open conversations about how to meet the needs for safety that everyone shares? Creating a culture of safety can be challenging and requires commitment and effort, but it is well worth it because it is the essential foundation for healing trauma and promoting resiliency and recovery.
So this is really a fundamental shift away from business as usual to asking ourselves, how am I ensuring trauma-informed values and principles in everything that I do?